Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Jim Harter of the Gallup organization. I will tell you all about Jim in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment we exert for others. And when you do it from a leadership position, as you will definitely discover that Jim is, you do it with a singular purpose of bringing people together for common cause. Jim Harter, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
Thanks for having me on your show, John. Great to be with you today.
Great. I want to tell folks a little bit about you. You are a PhD and I think psychometrics, if I understood, but you've done a lot of other doctoral studies. You are the chief scientist at Gallup organization. You've done over 1,000 studies of workplace effectiveness. You're a best-selling author. You had a #1 Wall Street Journal bestseller called It's the Manager, and you're a best-selling author of 12 The Elements of Great Managing and Well-Being, the 5 Essential Elements. It's also Well-Being at Work. Your brand new book, it could not be more topical. It's Culture Shock. And it focuses on what we are facing today with the workplace in flux. So, Jim Harter, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
Thanks a lot, John.
Great. So here's a statement that I got from you. According to Gallup, employee engagement is at a 7-year low, leading to a customer revolt and $7 trillion in lost productivity. That's 11% of global GDP. That's pretty frightening. So how do we save even $1 trillion, Jim?
Well, you'll see we've got a State of the Global Workplace report coming out in a couple of weeks. And so I'd keep an eye out for that. We'll be updating those global statistics. We did see a dip down in engagement globally. In the US, it has been dropping in the last few years after a whole decade of growth. And then we've kind of lost a lot of that growth. And I think we can get it back, but we've got to have the right management practices in place to do it.
Great. Well, that's perfect because that's what your book, Culture Shock, focuses on. So here's the dichotomy, as you well know. Bosses want employees back in the office, but employees are maybe less than enthusiastic. So is hybrid the answer? What does your research tell us, Jim?
So I think people have gone through a kind of a reevaluation of what work can be and what it should be. We've all gone through this forced experiment that the pandemic brought, and people have learned some things. They've learned some things that have worked that they didn't know would work before. Some more independent work. They've learned that they do prefer, almost everybody in a remote ready job, 90% prefer some type of remote or hybrid work. So I think leaders need to take into account those preferences. When we ask people why, they say, one, the commute, I can avoid the commute. That's a rational reason. It's better for my well-being. It's better for my family. I think organizations need to take that into account. But what we find is that some combination, we got to get this combination right, but there's some combination of in-person and remote work for remote ready people is right. We found about 2 to 3 days for highly collaborative jobs, get you a peak in engagement. But I think there's even bigger issues than where people are sitting that we've got to solve for going into the future.
Well, there's a woman that I've had on my show a couple of times, and I'm pretty sure you would know her work, Callie Williams-Yost, who works on the future of work. And she says that her theory is that this work to hybridization or remote work was in the works. COVID simply expanded it. But she says now, her work, that one size doesn't fit all as far as hybrid or remote or full-time. Is that your experience, Jim?
Absolutely, and I would tend to agree with her. There was a trend. It was a very slow-moving trend toward people wanted flex time before the pandemic hit. The younger workers, all generations really wanted more flex time, and remote work was on a slow rise. I think we may have accelerated it by 20 years in a year with everything that happened with the pandemic. But everybody got to experience that. And what we found is that, unfortunately, right now, people aren't making the decision about where they work in a very organized way. It's either, this might seem organized, but if a leader saying everybody get back in the office, or an individual saying I'm going to do what I want, and the leader saying that's fine, something in between there is a lot better. And very few people, only 13% of people, tell us they decide where they're going to work with their team. And every job is a little bit different. Some jobs have more asynchronous collaboration. Some jobs have more ongoing collaboration. And I think we got to consider that. We've got to consider where we get our best work done. We've got to consider culture, innovation, how we solve problems. And in person, we know matters a lot. If we can make it happen, we need to make it happen. We have different relationships and a different kind of culture when it does happen. But I would use that general rule of try to build some days when you know people are going to be there. We'd recommend Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. It doesn't have to be that, and let people adjust based on the work that they're doing. And make sure it's a commitment to the team. It's a commitment to fellow colleagues, not necessarily a commitment to leadership. But leaders need to take a stance on here's why it's important for us to have people together and clearly articulate that.
Right. No, that's very good. And I'm glad you talked about the emphasis on, I hadn't heard it quite phrased that way, Jim, but it's not so much manager or employee to manager, it's colleague to colleague. And that is a whole different dimension. And how does that play out? Are you seeing employees as teams deciding what to do, or how does that manifest itself, Jim?
I think it does have to start with leadership and management saying these are the days when we're going to build an in-person culture, and still allow some flexibility around that based on the jobs. But then the manager needs to lead the team in having a discussion about the kind of work they're trying to get done and really filter those decisions through three criteria. One, your individual performance, your individual work, how that gets done. Two, how we collaborate best as a team, to get them talking about the best collaboration times they've had and how those have, what's actually happened in those in-person meetings that's been really uplifting for them and useful in terms of getting work done. And three, what brings value to customers. In many cases, customers are at your offices. They may not be, but you still might get better customer work done when you're together. So I'd filter it through those three criteria. And if it meets that threshold, it's and in some cases, you got to almost add a fourth about fun. There's some fun things that happen at work when you're together with people that you just can't predict. And I think that's something people often forget.
Yeah, I was working with a CEO who said that same kind of thing. He said, one of the things, this was during the lockdown, the post-lockdown, and he said, we're missing our Friday afternoon go for a beer event, or little things they would do, a pizza day, or, whatever they would do, that kind of thing. And it reminded me of the personal connection. So you tied this in, and the word you use, culture, and the title of your book is Culture Shock. So some might say, okay, if we're all disparate and hybrid, what happens to culture? So what's your response on that? Can we have the same kind of culture, or what do we need to do, Jim? So.
We can if we're well planned around, and if we have great managing. You can't really replace great managing with hardly any kind of policy. What we're seeing in the data right now, and this is the downside of this forced experiment, is that people did learn they can do some things differently from remote than they ever knew they could, more productive than they thought they could. But what's happened is we're seeing separation or some more distance between employee and employer. People are feeling more distant from their employer. That's the reason that's bad. Is the thing that leadership really wants is customer retention and customer growth. When people start feeling more separated from their employer, they also start to become psychologically separated from the customer. And they're even telling us now that they feel less responsible for the quality of service customers receive. That's not good. So we've got to close that gap, and we can't close that gap unless we have good management that's in touch with people on a regular basis, no matter where they're at. It might be in person, but it could also be in a remote setting. But we would argue every manager needs to have at least one meaningful conversation with each person they manage at least once a week. That can be 15 to 30 minutes if there's a cadence to it. But and go ahead, John.
I was going to say, so, and I have worked with folks who follow your thing. What should that conversation be? Should it be focused on the work? Should it be focused on coaching? What is your experience, Jim, or what would your best advice be? So,
well, I'll go right to the data. We asked people who had meaningful conversations what that entailed. The top thing that came on the list was recognition when I did good work. To do that right, you've got to know what the person's doing. You got to be in touch with them. You got to know what they're working on. You got to be able to notice that they did something well. So that requires authentic recognition where you really know what they accomplished. Number two, collaboration with their team. We just talked about that a little bit ago, but a discussion around how they can best collaborate with their team, and the manager's in the best position to know each person's situation, and to be able to really nudge employees in the direction that they need to be in terms of the people they need to collaborate with, and give them suggestions on how they can best collaborate with different people.
Right.
The third one is goals and priorities. They need to discuss goals. That's very work related, but important.
Now, here's a question, and I don't know if it's something you've come across in research, but some organizations, it's one size doesn't fit all. So, for example, office workers may have the flexibility of working physically in the office 1 to 3 days a week, whatever. But if it's a retail or a healthcare, and many employees have no choice. That it's 5 days a week or whatever, face to face every day. Are you seeing any kind of shifts or schisms in organizations that have that flexibility? Something that's been, I haven't seen any research on it.
On-site workers?
Yeah.
I think that's an important takeaway from all this. We can think about autonomy for people with remote-ready jobs, but we also ought to better be thinking about it for the people with on-site jobs and flexibility there, because they're human beings. We're all human beings. We all crave autonomy. And so there could be an us versus them kind of mentality going on if we don't do something about that. There's a lot of organizations thinking that way. The 4-day work week has come up some, and that is something people say they'd change a job for. It's an area where we've seen a little bit of a decrease in active disengagement, a little bit of increase in well-being. Nothing like that guarantees having engagement. You can't really replace good management. So you've got to have great management to begin with. So don't think about any policy like that replacing good management. It's not a magic pill you're going to take or anything like that. But start and stop time flexibility, some flexibility in terms of vacation times, PTO kinds of things they've been thinking about. That's something people would change a job for also.
Right.
And so those kind of flexible options, I think, might be realistic. I wouldn't say like a 4-day work week is the right solution for everybody. It's going to stress some people out. Burnout might be a little bit higher for some people because they're forced into that kind of blocked into those days instead of having more. So it's going to vary a little bit by person, but I'm not saying it's a bad solution. It can be the right solution.
Right. And that's a powerful thing. So now there's another issue that I've heard senior leaders talk about, and it's in the media as well. And I know you've done some research about that, is more senior workers will say, we have to bring our new younger workers, not millennials, but the Gen Z folks in, because they need to learn how to, quote, work with people. What does the research say about that, Jim?
Well, that's a really important point, John. What we're seeing in the data right now are that younger workers are the ones who are feeling even more distant from their employer, and particularly younger remote workers. And so, if you come to work and you don't know what's expected of you, or you don't feel you have chances to develop, historically, young people have had more chances to develop for the right reasons, right, than older people. That gap is starting to shrink, and it's shrunk down to the level where they don't have any more opportunities than older workers. And so if you're a young worker and you feel like you can work from home, it better be a very task-oriented job, because a lot of development happens in person. And I think it is a responsibility not only for the younger worker, but also for the older worker who could be a mentor to show up and be there as well. There's a lot of things you can't predict that lead to good mentorship and good development. And young workers are missing out on development right now.
Right. And I was just thinking, although many of them were in college or as in high school and college, maybe involved in team activities, either sports or whatever it is. So they learn something about collegiality and stuff. But in a workforce, it's a different dynamic. They need to learn, my words, the rules of the road. Are you finding that, Jim? So,
a lot of that happens informally. A lot of learning in organizations happens it's not just a formal meeting or sending content across on email or Teams or whatever. It's a lot of how people develop and know what happens in organizations happens more informally, and I think it's hard to replace those in-person meetings when they can happen. You can do it, but you've got to be very good on video to make it happen.
Yeah, that's good. Something I thought about, and I'm sure your research covers it. This is at the beginning of the pandemic when everybody was remote, or not everybody, but many people. So And there's something about being promoted, recognized, as you said, which is a key thing that so many of us search for. But then there's the old axiom, proximity to power. So if I am a manager, am I going to have to get myself back into the office and I want to be promoted more than another colleague? What does research say about that, Jim?
Well, I think, yeah. I think anyone in a leadership position, whether it's a frontline manager, a middle manager, or upper management, needs to set the example. And if they're talking about the importance of in-person time, they've got to set the example themselves. And I think that people are more likely to come in if they know that their manager is going to be there. If they don't, it just seems like an empty kind of request to them.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, anybody who wants to develop is going to. You think about the in-person bias that occurs. It's just human nature, right?
Sure.
You're going to have a higher probability of things going your direction if you're in person than if you're not.
Right. Now, a term I haven't heard, at least for a couple of months or so, is Great Resignation. You recast this as the Great Reshuffling. So in the Great Reshuffling, where's the power dynamic? Is it with the employee? Is it with the boss? Or it depends?
Well, up to now, if you're thinking about it in mass, up to now, it's since the pandemic has hit, except for a few months, it's clearly been in the hands of the employee, where they've got a lot of choice, and they've leveraged that choice, and that's where you have in the second half of 2021 a lot of exodus and a lot of rehiring. Both quit rates and hire rates went up. They're still pretty high. The quit rates have dropped a little bit, but it's still pretty close to 4 million a month. So 3.7 I think is the last one I looked at. So it's still at a very high rate, even though there's been some layoffs, et cetera. The quit rates are still pretty high, and I would argue at this point in time, except for a few exceptions in some organizations, it's still an employee's market, and that's why there's such a struggle right now with what do we do with all this remote work. Well,
Right.
The answer I would say is you've got to have great managers, and that's very solvable for everybody, no matter what the economy is bringing.
Great. Well, you use the term, instead of resignation, reshuffling. What specifically does reshuffling mean? Why did you choose that term?
Well, people didn't just resign and go home. They got other jobs. They might have gotten a job in another industry, or they might have got a job in the same industry with a different company. And pay was a factor there to some extent. We asked people why they left, but like 3/4 of the reasons people gave were related to employee engagement or well-being reasons. Pay did come into play, but pay was a function of how engaged they were in the first place. So people needed more money to leave if they're engaged than if they're not engaged or actively disengaged.
Great. Now, you have something in your book called the CEO Playbook. What is it, and what are the takeaways in it, Jim?
Yeah, the one that we're really highly encouraging is just accept hybrid. It's not going away. We think it's going to be here for a long time. Probably, maybe it's a permanent. I would argue if I was going to place a bet on, I'd say that hybrid work is now a permanent part of our workplace culture, and embrace hybrid. Second, pick some days. We would recommend Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and just announce those as in-person days. It doesn't mean that you're mandating that everybody be in on exactly the same days, but you're setting a standard for when we're going to develop an in-person culture, and those are our in-person days. And third, every manager in the organization needs to have what we call a meaningful conversation once a week. We've got to upskill managers so they can do that effectively. Otherwise, you're going to lose touch with people, and this hybrid thing will not work. Hybrid won't work if it's not organized. Hybrid employees right now, they are a little bit more engaged, but they're also higher stress, higher burnout. And so we've got to build some predictability into hybrid so that it actually works. And we've got to have great managers who are in touch with people, or it absolutely will not work.
At first blush, when you say hybrid work is higher stress and higher burnout, that almost seems counterintuitive, because earlier you had said people want hybrid so they don't have to commute, they can be with kids and stuff. So where are the factors inducing stress, Jim? So
Unpredictability. You've entered a variable of unpredictability into the culture, and people don't, unless there's some organization around it, people don't know when their fellow employees are coming and going. They show up to work, nobody's there, they wasted their commute time. We've got to build clarity of expectations drops. We've got to build systems inside organizations to make this autonomous hybrid environment work effectively. And we've got to do that with great managers who are in touch with people. We've got to do it by setting some standards about when we are going to be together, so that we do build a real culture where people can innovate, solve problems, have fun, in all the ways that are natural to our brains.
great.
Another thing, John, is culture audit. We highly recommend every leader do a culture audit to set their aspired culture, identify what they really want their organization to be, and figure out what the barriers are to getting there.
Now, I'm going to ask almost a layup question, but it seems so overlooked. And so, how about listening to employees? How is that, Jim? So.
That's it is a layup. But that's meaningful conversation once a week, right there in a nutshell, is you're opening the door to listen to what the employees accomplished, so you can recognize them effectively, listen to what their goals and priorities are and what's getting in the way, whether you need to reframe those for them. You're listening to how they best collaborate with their fellow colleagues, so you can let other colleagues know what's working and what isn't. You're listening to their strengths too. I haven't brought that up. A way to shorten the distance between people, and anybody that knows Gallup knows that we focus a lot on strengths. We've got a tool for that it really does build efficiency, though, and it closes a big gap. And when we're in a hybrid environment where we're more distant from other people more often, and I talked about employees being more separated from their employers, we've got to have methods like that shorten the distance between people, so that we can have effective conversations and listen better than we ever have before.
No, I mean, when you say that's a good word, and it could overlook, but what do you mean by shorten? Do you mean physical proximity or more frequency? What does it mean, Jim? So.
Psychologically, shorten the distance. So when we are physically more apart, psychologically we start growing a bit more apart as well. It's that whole line about proximity. But psychologically, we can shorten the distance if I know what your strengths are, and every time we meet, I know I have those front and center. I know how we need to talk to one another. I know why something I observed from a distance actually happened the way that it did with you. And so I've got ways to make sense out of how we're working together that are just much more efficient, and we feel more like friends than even though we're not together all the time, we feel more like friends than we would have otherwise. Otherwise, I'm sitting here trying to wonder, why is John acting the way that he's acting? Why is he, is he bothered by something I said? There's all kinds of those things from a distance that go through people's minds.
Right. Well, since you mentioned the word psychological shortening, which I love that phrase, my mind leaps to Amy Edmondson's work, of course, in psychological safety. So what effect is hybridization or remote or mixed having on psychological safety? Have you come across that at all, Jim? So.
Well, we found that there are some metrics that we need to put in place that are new to this changed workplace. They're especially important. One is whether people feel like they're treated with respect. It's very basic, but it relates to psychological safety. It relates to how people know one another, and it relates to DEI types of issues. And it's really important. If people don't give us strongly agree to that, then there's something going wrong, and we have to figure out ways that we continuously treat one another with respect. I think good, high-functioning organizations always have an environment where there's high critique, but it's got to be respectful critique, and that happens better if we lean on that concept I just threw out a little bit ago on strengths. If I know you for your strengths, I'm much more likely to treat you with respect and not treat you in a way that you feel disrespected unintentionally. I might do that.
Right. So you've talked several times, and I think it's important. And you hit train our managers, upskill them, make them more aware of great management. You can't replace that. So, in a world of hybridization or remote, what suggestions do you have for developing managers, other than the great library of courses and work from the Gallup organization?
Well, I think there's some general principles that you need to follow if you want to get this right. One is that you need to have a science-based curriculum that's easy for managers to absorb and apply, and it needs to be grounded in science. One of the problems we've had in our field is that we've had volumes of great science in our field that just hasn't been applied effectively. So we've got to have teachers that can teach the concepts in ways that managers make sense to managers and make their jobs more efficient. We would argue that there's three content areas that are really important. One is a strengths basis for understanding human beings and
Mhm.
human development. Second is some basic engagement concepts that we know link to performance outcomes consistently. And third is performance management. Those three things have to fit together. They can't be separate things that managers have to pull together. We can teach them together in synchrony so that it's easy for managers to do their jobs. We've got to make their jobs easier. And then second, we've got to build some practice and some peer feedback so that peer managers can share ideas over time. So all these concepts become part of my life, become part of my repertoire. I practice having those meaningful conversations and check-ins with people. I've got a script I can follow if I don't know which questions to ask myself.
Right.
And practice is important. So it's more like I guess I'd think of it more like a journey where you have the curriculum combined with a lot of things that happen outside the curriculum that make it real in their lives, and it's more likely to become, we call it a coaching habit. You've got to
Mhm.
make these kinds of behaviors into what we call a coaching habit if you're going to make it work.
I love how you, first of all, coaching, that's great, but also the idea of the peer to peer. So I would think, because I'm a member of an organization, 100 Coaches, founded by Marshall Goldsmith, and we have a good network and we share a lot and stuff. So you can do the same kind of thing with peers virtually. Is that your experience, Jim? I found,
Yeah. We just tested a bunch of that type of work. That it was all done during COVID. I think almost 100% of it was virtual, and we found significant. We're talking. We tracked outcomes 9 to 18 months after all this happened, including the peer part in the curriculum and everything, and we saw 20% plus reductions in turnover rates, significant increases in employee engagement for those teams. It really works if you do what I just said, and you include that
yeah,
peer piece is important, I think, because
yeah.
you can do it all virtual.
Yeah, and just to drill down there. So let's just say that you and I are peers at the Gallup organization, and you have more managerial experience than I do, but I'm new into, not new manager, but I'm wrestling with a delegation issue or a communication issue with employees. So it's the kind of peer to peer where I can have honest and open conversations with, hey, Jim, have you ever had this? So we have that type of thing. Is that
Exactly.
what you're talking about? Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. It's real tangible experiences that each of you have had. You may have had very different experiences. We're both going to have ideas we can share with one another about how we approached an issue, how we leveraged the strengths of somebody in a way that somebody else hadn't thought of. So a lot of there's a lot you can teach in courses, but it's hard to replace what actually happens in real lives, and it's a
That's
way to
right.
get there.
Well, Jim, we are racing toward the end of our show. We could go on and on and on, but I know you have other things to do. But I always, as you know, I ask every guest a question about the topic of grace. Do you have a story you'd like to share with us, Jim? So,
Um, so 2 years ago, my wife was diagnosed with cancer. She's overcome that now, and she's recovering. Um, but during that time, I really realized all the grace that people show, whether it's just bringing something over, um, letters from our chairman, um, all kinds of just people reaching out and caring and being a part of getting her to where she's at today. Um, you know, you notice those kinds of things when you go through tough times for sure. And I saw that in our company for sure.
That's a wonderful story, and it shows it's a small thing. And I'm not being dismissive, but it's not an employee wide type thing. It's just a human recognition that you're a valued employee, and your spouse was going through a health challenge, and people reached out as human beings, and that's grace. So that's wonderful. Jim, it's a pleasure to talk to you. And the new book is Culture Shock. How can people find you or the book?
Well, we update all of our research continuously on Gallup.com. Just go out there. You'll see our new State of the Global Workplace report in a couple of weeks. And go to Amazon.com, and you can just type in Culture Shock, and you can grab the book as well.
Great. Jim, you and I said before the show, you have been helpful to me. A dozen years ago, I was working on a book, and you opened the vault of Gallup research to me. And I say thank you, my friend. And thank you for being on the show again today, Jim. And good luck with the book.
Thanks for having me, John. Greatly appreciated.
Good.